So I'm going to do two things today. One is to talk a little bit about this core curriculum piece, because it's fascinating to somehow move. We're in Florida next week for 2 days. All right, wild place around the Common Core, wild. All right, then we're heading to Northwest the following week for 2 days in Seattle, even wilder in some senses in terms of what's going on in Washington and Oregon, and so we're totally different. All right. And we've just come out of California, where this conversation is, again, completely different than it is here. And so one thing that I want to do is simply say, here's what it looks like from a wandering team who does this kind of support work across the country, side to side, up and down. And it is very complicated, but there are maps that basically say, here's where this is, so that I think there's a value to that. This is where you're playing inside it. All right, and Illinois, it's great. You can imagine after 20 years of Ford and the UAW to have Dearborn in the room. It's kind of a nice feeling for me. It's like going home, because that's where we fought the fight in many ways. So it's kind of an attempt to see that warp and woof, and then understand in some senses every day what's going on at the deeper level. So that's the first piece. Second piece is in some senses to give you kind of 10, 15, 20, 30 years of kind of talk and reflection around collaborative structures, because that thing in some senses is very tricky to do over against kind of the surrounding war. And the question is, are we sophisticated enough to do both? All right, and by that I simply mean, how do you in many, many ways stay after the deep reform work at the same time that at state levels across the country and sometimes at local levels you have to fight the fight. You have to stop craziness and so forth. So that requires a certain kind of warrior and a certain kind of frame. And I think there's got to be tools to do that as well. So first piece is this Common Core. All right, we all know that in some deep sense, it's hooked to a profound kind of realignment of the profession itself. All right. We all also know that it came out of the most bizarre of political scenes in which actually 45 states decided to do something together. Now that number's shrinking fast, all right, and we ought to have some moment of prayer after lunch for O'Rourke in Indiana, all right. This is where Hoosiers, standards for Hoosiers, all right. Probably we ought to have prayer for Hoosier children, all right? At any rate, here's what this thing looks like at some deep level. If you stop and think about St. Louis a month ago, all right, the Department of Education had its, Joe, third or fourth, meeting of collaborative work of all of the sponsors, if you will, of public education of the country. So in the room, all right, are the two unions, Chief State School Officers, Great City Schools, National School Board Association, and the administrators group. So all of the sponsoring organizations. For 2 days with about 450 people from across the country, we talked about collaborative work around the Common Core. So what I want to say to you, at the national level, if you hook in here, Randy is very clear at the table. Dennis is very clear at the table, all right, that this work is their work. So if you read the paper every day, you think in some senses this is up for grabs at some deep level. It is not up for grabs, all right? It is in, you get the Wisconsin and the Indiana kind of crazy kind of state level, and I'll talk about it in a minute, kind of jump back on this thing. But if you look at it kind of deeply, two things are happening. This thing is in some senses gone. This is my opinion. This thing already departed. And the reason it departed is because there's a dollar sign on it, let's say it straight, and Pearson and everybody else is gone. So if you think you're going to buy curriculum material anywhere else in the world that supports anything else but the Common Core, you're crazy, all right? So whether you make some sort of kind of symbolic gesture, God help us, in Wisconsin or Indiana about this, in some senses it's academic, right? This thing is done, and that's quite a profound statement. It means that in some senses, no matter what you teach, whatever materials you're going to get are already readjusted, all right, to this thing because there are billions of dollars at stake. It's sad to say, but that's the ballgame, all right? That's important to say, because it means that two things have happened kind of overnight in the sense of 2 or 3 years. First of all, the national group is still lined up quite powerfully in some senses, and I could talk more deeply around who's really in and who's somewhat in. Kathy, from the you've got to talk to Randy's kind of personal person in here, because of this group, this national group. I would have to say that two things have happened. Kathy is, in some senses, Kathy Buzard is the single staff person for that entire national approach, and I think we are, in some senses, her helpmate. All right, we have emerged, all right, as the facilitators of this group nationally, and that's really important for us because it keeps us hooked to the two national unions. It keeps us hooked to the chief state school officers, who are, in some senses, I mean, think what they're trying to do. They've got all of these governors shifting every 2 or 3 years with their education officers, sometimes elected differently than they, i.e. Wisconsin, all right, and sometimes appointed by them. The point is that thing's all over the place, and they've got to somehow stay politically steady in this thing and support it if they can. Not easy to do, all right? Think about the origins of that. That comes out of Florida, Jeb Bush, and some Republican sponsors of the Common Core. Think how far that's come in terms of who now owns it and who now kind of deeply supports it. Point is, you've got to have some moment in which you understand, I think this thing is still deeply embedded and supported, and de facto the materials are already moving, and that's a huge shift. Now, the problem, of course, everybody in the room knows, but Illinois is in some senses fairly unique here and way out in front, all right, for all sorts of reasons. Out in front in the sense that when Joe's favorite group, the Department of Education, moved on this piece, I think all of us agree, they moved a little fast. And by that I simply mean when you try and couple, all right, the movement of a Common Core curricular piece and the standards, and you couple it with some sort of attempt, thank God Park and Smarter Balance are here, some wonderful, kind of thoughtful people from there, and somebody said, let's measure how it's happening to children, and then the department said, oh, by the way, all right, here's the hooker, and within 2 years, you're going to basically connect. All right, a test that we do not know measures anything, let alone teacher effectiveness, we're going to basically, within a couple of years, hook it to a teacher evaluation. That throws everything off kilter. And I want to say, in some senses, the fascinating piece is that where this is calmest and where this is really working is, of all places, California, that 2 or 3 years ago you wouldn't have given a nickel for. And here's why. They push back all of the pressure on testing, said to the Department of Education, no, we're not going to give a test that doesn't count in 2 years. We're simply going to take a couple of years and do our work and get ready. Number two, that lovely governor and ex-Jesuit, I might add, Jerry Brown, found them $3 billion and gave it to the districts and said, take 2 years and let your teachers train each other around what this really means. And in the process, they wrote a real simple kind of piece of legislation that says, and you'll spend that money collaboratively. You will seek counsel from the organized labor group to decide how to do that. So a little sentence that basically said, you'll do it together. Now, you should see what's going on in California. It's breathtaking. When we start CalTurn, we've got the superintendent of schools of the state, we've got the CTA executive director. All right, to think that the CTA would be in the room around deep reform 3 years ago would have been silliness. All right? So all of a sudden in California, it's calm, it's deep, it's thoughtful, and we've got communities of practice of districts with 60 and 70 schools coming together collaboratively to basically work the Common Core together and share their learning, right? So there are places, deep places, but I want to point out how different it is. You can go from California, where there are resources, time, a collaborative structure, and some space to do it well, all the way to New York, where it's on fire. And it's on fire because this thing got jammed so fast, all right, around teacher evaluation with punitive results early on, and there is no choice but, in some senses, to almost blow it up and start again. And the point is, Common Core gets swept into that, all right? Even though, in some senses, we've got all sorts of districts, as the Federation and the EA does, that are doing deep work within New York at the next levels down. So my point really is to give you some map that says, in my judgment, at the national level, this thing's rock solid for all intents and purposes. It is wild in here, all right? From Indiana to Tennessee to Florida. And if you stop and spin that out just a few minutes, all right, in the next 3 years, all right, the first 10 lawsuits, all right, if anything is clear around the first 3 or 4 in Florida, New York, and so forth, nobody's going to win the first 4 or 5 lawsuits around use of this student data for teacher evaluation. It's hopeless. All right? And that's a big deal because politically it means that they're going to lose boom, 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 boom. All right? Which means that I think we're going to be in this room 2 years from now saying, one more time, how do we take a walk down this road of teacher evaluation collaboratively? Because I think the thing ought to be on the table and we ought to be working it deeply because we haven't. But it can't be stampeded into this piece, and it won't be, all right? Florida's first, the EA's brought the first one in Florida. That's a slam dunk for the union. It basically is taking I think three places where they've used evaluation for 50% of the teachers who didn't teach those children to evaluate them over against the 50% of the results, in quote, results, of this 50% who did teach. That's the level at which one's going to have to stop the train. Well, we've got more and more of those. The fundamental question is coming, I think, out of New York, and it's the one we really, instead of polarizing on this, somewhere we've got to, and I think, again, we'll be in this room working it. The real issue is, here's what we've done. We ought to go up, if you will, with respect to rigor. But at the same time, we've got to think about what that has done to all of our work with poor children, because we just made it twice as tough. Or at least another fourth or third as tough. So what do we do? In some senses, forget the evaluation piece for a moment, although it's hooked to this, all right? We've got to figure out how you take up rigor, standards, higher curriculum, deeper thinking, and so forth, and at the same time, figure out this poverty issue. And do it in such a way that you not only do not penalize professionals who choose to work with those children, but actually reward it. All right. That's the debate we have to have in quiet, thoughtful rooms around this. And I think we will after we have some explosions through here. All right? But these explosions, make no mistake, are going to be around evaluation and the use of measurements of this thing, and in some senses are just way too fast with way too crude a machine. All right? When you get to the locals, and I just wanted to drop down here, all right, our experience is that at locals and at school site, we are after this. Schaumburg will be a wonderful example. We've got examples in this room of collaborative approaches at both the district and the site levels that are rather remarkable and really powerful. So if you look across the country, even when in some senses at the state level this is a bit chaotic, all right, this thing at the national level and this thing at the school, site, and practical level is in some senses moving quite powerfully. My best example, to finish my argument, is if you looked for the best material for teachers around how to go after this thing and train, it's on the two national union sites. Look at the federation's, all right, lesson plans. It's the two national unions who've provided the best, if you will, support for teachers in classrooms doing this work. You got to pay attention to that because that means something's moving at several levels all around this chaos in blue. Right? Now, it's just one man's frame on this thing, but I'm making 2 or 3 projections. Number 1, I think it's solid and it's moving. Number 2, I think the material's already left the station and it's going to be tough to buy anything that isn't Common Core in a year or 2. And number 3, this is not an aberration. It's clear that we jumped the gun way, way too fast. It's also, at least to me, clear that it's very tough in the first, we're going to hand pick these things, all right? Can you imagine what a good lawyer is going to do in Florida in about 3 hours with that argument, all right, of evaluating these people who never taught these children? I mean, come on. We could make that argument, all right? So, And I think that in some senses, the lovely piece is that this material gets better every day, and in schools and in locals across the country, we're learning how to do this with each other. And that's what we're going to work on today. So the next day or two is in some senses to explain, to kind of examine, how's it going with respect to this kind of work, all right, number one. Number two, we've got both with representation of both Park and Smarter Balance, so they can talk to us about, in some senses, what's this assessment, what's the direction this is going to go, because we're going to measure this. And we're going to measure it in a wonderful set of ways, but think about this. Not only is that test, or set of tests, going to basically move out, be standardized, who knows how long the validation will take, but think what else has happened. Almost everybody in this room is at the real deep work where we don't have these standards, and we don't have, in some senses, an assessment. We are, for the first time, looking at end of year, end of course, deep collaborative work around what it is we're really trying to do with children, and we're making common kinds of assessment with each other around this. That's the ball game anyway. All right, is to basically say, it's our work, we know where we're trying to go, and we'll design the deep assessments, and we'll hold each other responsible. All right? So again, my argument would be, it's still moving very, very strongly at the deeper levels, right? And I think encouragingly. So, those are the arguments I'm making. I could be wrong. It's really fun, as you can imagine, to see this thing play itself out. And to see how volatile it is in some senses. It's almost always volatile around adult games. It almost has nothing to do with children learning or even the profession. And I guess my last piece of data is, if you listen to where it's coming from two extremes. All right? When you find yourself in bed with the tea party, you better pay attention to how the hell you got there. All right? When you wake up in the morning, yeah, this is not a good choice you made. All right? So be very careful, all right, on that piece. And with that said, here we go. One last kind of intellectual thought, and then we'll take our break. And this is, in some senses, what do we know, and how do we think? You know, Joe and I did 20 years of work with Mary and other people in this room around collaborative structures. And actually, I did 20 years of work at Ford and the UAW, steelworkers and Boeing and machinists and so forth around this kind of attempt to span. Here's the challenge. When you have large organizations and you are trying to move the marker, all right? And by marker, I mean simply your measurement and your ideal standards around what you do. It turns out that you need a very sophisticated way to do it, and it turns out that your instinct is to do it wrong. And here's what I mean. When you're trying to build a better Ford product, ultimately, you have all sorts of sets of skills up in here around processes and so forth and so on. But bottom line, you have to basically figure out how to measure it at the delivery level, and you have to involve, in a highly supportive and trusting way, every UAW guy who does the work. You have to build him teams, you have to give him the skills, in some senses, to figure out where the hell he is, and you have to listen to him when he says, I could do the machine better this way, I could make the part better this way. Think about that. In some senses, no matter how huge you are, you must open the system. Then, in order to make it happen, you have to go to your partner, whether you like it or not, which happens to be the organized labor group that represents these ladies and gentlemen, and you have to say, I need them differently in here. I need their heads, their skills, their caring, and I can't get it without you. I can't get it without you in terms of their attitudes and their caring, and I can't get them without the time to basically do this work. So I have to change two things with you, my partner, my union partner. I have to drop to the site where I do the work. I have to empower the men and women who do the work. I have to give them tools, and then I have to sit down together and listen to them. And I have to redesign both union and management processes to support what it is they're telling me. That's, after you say everything else, that's the work. And so I would argue that we know something about how to do that, all right? I think, and you've heard me 1,000 times probably on this, but there, I drew it, all right? This is a union management board, and of course when I say the board here, I mean also this wonderful set of very complex community leaders and so forth out here. Peoria is a really interesting kind of representation in here. We've got the mayor's key person in terms of education, and we've built, with the board there, a structure here to, in some senses, understand what we're doing in order to build. We are not going to change, all right, how we educate poor children at Peoria High School unless this community and all of its resources come to help us. We don't have a chance. Well, you got to have a structure to do that. So what we do is you typically try and build some sort of a labor management structure here. And here's the key to, in some senses, changing the world, and it's counterintuitive for us. You've got to have some leadership off the union, as you well know in this model. You've got to have some superintendent support, somebody in teaching and learning, and so forth. I think you've got to have a couple of key board members. Danville's here with that representation, for instance, all right? And then you've got to have a couple of key principals and some staff, but you've got to basically have something here that represents what I call a we. You got to have some place where the system says, this is where we are, all right, and has to tell the truth about what state these schools are in, the leadership, the culture, and so forth. This is the place where, in some senses, you must publicly own the work together. That is not something we do naturally. The union owns the work, the management owns the work, we own it separately. You know, I often tell stories. When I first came out of Harvard, I didn't know how to do anything except kind of take notes, all right? But these people at Ford and UAW would pay me to go into Indianapolis, listen for 5 days, and then give them a report. And it turned out that in some senses, they were all there. They just didn't know how to listen to their own folks, and they would pay me to do that for a while. And since I knew how to do nothing else, I knew how to I'd take notes, all right, and give them that data. You have to know and have a place where you tell the truth about where you are in terms of culture, climate, teaching skills, in some senses, the level of trust and work. And if you're really good, and we did it in Minneapolis for many years with a really interesting superintendent, put 4 seniors on this team. All right? The problem with the 4 seniors is that they will tell the truth. All right? And without fear and actually without anything. I mean, they're just not going to bring a political agenda. And so they will say, well, nobody does any work in that school. Well, you can hear a pin drop, all right, with the adults in that room, superintendent, board chair, and so forth, when 4 seniors unanimously say in those 3 schools, there is nothing going on with respect to learning. Well, that's a little bit of truth-telling, all right? And it's a little bit of truth-telling that that system has to have a place to own. Here's the second piece. When you get this together, management and union, for all intents and purposes, comes with a prejudice that you make a plan. All right? And you make a plan somehow to say, this is what the Common Core ought to look like. Here's the time we will do it. Here's the professional development that we will use, and so forth and so on. Wrong strategy. All right? And here's the reason. This group doesn't know. All right? After the first day, you don't know what it is they need. The only group that knows is this group. And the elementary needs something different than the middle school, the high school. So what you need to do here, this is the counterintuitive piece, you need to open the system. And by that I mean give it permission to go after these issues. Number 2, give them some resources. All right? Set some broad parameters. All right? You can't, my parameters for my children with cars is you couldn't cross more than 2 state lines without permission. All right? Give them some broad parameters. Give them some money. Give them permission to go after it. All right? Give them some parameters and then start listening collaboratively, jointly. Start listening to what it is they say they need to do and how they need to do it. And be ready to redesign the systems you're responsible for to support that kind of work. This is going to be forever. This is not about Common Core after all is said and done. This is about changing this profession and the way it works together. Which means you're going to have to renegotiate the work itself, the role of a teacher, the use of time. This is an industrial model. To stop making parts is downtime and lost time. You've got to change that profoundly. Where are you going to learn how to do that except to listen to people who say, I need at least a half a day a week of this kind of work together in order to do this forever. Forever. I'm going to have to redesign assessments forever together. I'm going to have to watch each other teach and get better at it forever, all right? So that means that in some senses, the time redesign and the work itself, the profession itself, they have to teach us. Yes, they'll do Common Core. Yes, they'll get better at the curriculum, the pedagogy, and so forth. The real issue is, do you have a place where you can redesign, not just for the 6 schools that are walking point on this, but for everybody? Do you have a place to give permission, let them do the work, listen and learn from them? The second piece is you need to, in some senses, do a simple requirement, all right, around the parameters. And I think the second piece you want is you want to require some sort of a collaborative structure at the site. But it is a different role than this work. This is, in some senses, you're saying to staff, principals, and so forth, look for ways to engage deeply in ways that make a difference for you, and engage parents if you can, and students if you can, if they're old enough and ready, all right? Look for ways for them to do the work we've been asked to do, and look for ways to, in some senses, get after it with everything you've got. So what you're saying to them is, look for deep involvement, broad involvement, all right? And then somehow your job is, in some senses, to do the work, and in some senses, go after it every which way you can. Don't rely on somebody up here to say, here's the professional development and so forth. You can give them access to it. You can say, look here and here. That's what I mean by parameters. But empower here and get ready to visit and listen and learn. And the last piece of it, and this is right out of Meg Wheatley of 25 years ago, the last piece we don't know how to do is, when you as a collaborative structure visit the middle school, the Peoria high schools, and so forth, all right, and you see what is and is not working, go back up here and broadcast to the entire system. Say to the entire system, we were out in the middle school, hear me here, we were out in the middle school yesterday, and here's what they are working on. This is not working, they told us. This is, and they're going back to the drawing board with respect to this. Hear what happens there. In one sentence, if you can say it publicly, what you basically say is, first of all, truth-telling, and you do it jointly. Number 2, you basically say, when you say this is not working, nobody says that. Say it publicly. Because when you say it publicly together, you basically say, we're honoring their truth-telling to us, and we're going to honor it to everybody. Number 3, you say, this is what's working, and this whole system, 2 things happen. They never learn from one another. We best ball them against each other, so they're not going to share anyway. All right? And so what you're trying to say is, this learning at the middle school is our learning. Right? And when you do that, you build just a little bit. You increase the we. A little bit the culture of collaboration, common owning of all of these students together. What your job here to do is to say, this thing's in process. It will always be in process. It's learning deeply from the people who do the work and who know the work. And our job is to listen and learn and redesign systems to support that. That's a different model than, in some sense, a top-down model in which we decide what it is they need and how to do it. Now, long and short, the fascinating piece about this is you can do this at 100 levels. I mean, I think Kathy and Joe, all right, are involved in some senses at building this at a national level. I mean, our job is to basically gather at least twice a year. We got a commitment. We've got some Ford Foundation money to do it. We're going to sit in Washington about twice a year, and they are committed to listen to, all right, the sites, the structures, the locals, say to them, this is working, this isn't. For God's sakes, give us some national policy that does this and so forth, at least. And notice how different that is. We've got actually, it's not the Department of Education driving this. It's the 8 entities that own it anyway who are saying, we are going to listen at every level to this thing as it tells us what the journey is like. That's not bad in terms of a collaborative learning structure. We used this model across Ford Europe. We had 8 different countries, 8 different unions from the communist unions, and by the way, we ought to salute today. I ought to be in a parade somewhere with some communists, somewhere in the world today, because I always used to do that when I was 25. But bottom line, somewhere, God bless them, they're out there. So the communist unions in Spain, the work councils in Germany, we had enormous different learning. But we were trying to change the culture of Ford Europe. All right, with all of those different nations. How different is that than these crazy states? I mean, what, you got a common strategy for Florida, Tennessee, and California? Come talk to me. All right, the only common strategy is to get after, all right, the deep empowerment and work here and go as fast as you can with them. And what other option is there? We will do the other, which is to somehow impose it on them. All right, and in some senses they won't own it. We won't, in some senses, have learned anything because we don't have a place to listen to them do it. So my job this morning was, in some senses, to do 2 things. One is to say, how's the nation going with this? All you get is one man's opinion on that. But number 2, to somehow run through what it is we believe and what it is we try and do here, and have tried to do in Illinois for a long time, Minnesota. We certainly did the same thing in Wisconsin. In the room here, we did the same thing. We built a collaborative structure at the state level. We tried. Right? We held it for 5 or 6 years in each case. We did it in Illinois. Then we tried to drop the collaborative structures at the local level. And then ultimately, this thing is the driver of the learning. And then you have to have a way to talk about it openly. That is still counterintuitive, I have to say. But if you stop and think about it in the macro level, and the last piece on that, that's what every good principal in the country does. Every good principal basically empowers at this level, and then just basically her job is to listen and support them as they move. And to, in some senses, create some sort of a collaborative structure to help her listen. Right, to help the administration with some lead teachers say, what are they doing? What are they learning? How should we move forward with them? It's a reverse process. It's the old dream. You learn to father, not from your father, but from your children. You have to listen and build listening structures. Otherwise, that first little book I wrote, there is not a listening bone in our body, right? In many ways. We just don't do this intuitively. We basically, if we get into any hierarchy, we think our job is to tell somebody what to do. And every time you do that, 2 things happen. You stop hearing, and the people in the hierarchy stop telling you the truth. So if I have 4 children, and they have contrary data I do not want to hear, they send the youngest with the data. They say to Katie, you tell him. All right? That's a big deal. Because when you first come in here and try and heal this, they will not tell you what it is they're working on. Why would they? And they'll never tell you what's not working. Why would they? Until you create a culture in which they will. And the only way to do that is, in some senses, to assure them that you'll tell the truth, and you'll tell the truth in such a way that's not punitive.